afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to yet another edition of our Research Futures webinar. Today, we're absolutely delighted to welcome our colleague from South Asia University in New Delhi, Dr. Ramani Garimella. Ramani, he's a very prolific researcher. She's published a great deal of articles, book chapters, and books on a great variety of topics. She's one of very few lawyers who work at the crossroad between disciplines. She's very interdisciplinary, to use a word that we like. So she works on international product law, transnational commerce, transnational arbitration, judgment, civil commercial matters, but she also works on concept ID, the theory of law, and to some extent, law and society, sociology of law. So that's for this reason that Ramani's profile is particularly interesting and relevant, and she's going to address today an equally interesting and extremely relevant question: race against caste. So what are we going to talk about? I have to tell you that we are not addressing this question from a historical, religious, anthropological or sociological perspective, but rather an international law one. And this is where it becomes particularly interesting, because it's not something which is often done. You hear a lot about race and caste. For those of you who know South Asia in particular, you hear often about these notions, these concepts, these realities, but mostly from a sociological, anthropological, religious, and also political perspective, but not as often from an international perspective. This is exactly what Ramani is going to do today, addressing race and caste from an international legal regime and critic perspective, with some approach from the twirl. She explained what's twirl to us later. Ramani, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you, Leila. That was pretty flattering introduction, and I don't know whether I really deserve it, but these are all, I have the luxury of indulging myself in these areas thanks to support of wonderful colleagues like you and university, which has been pretty gracious enough in supporting my thoughts and allowing me to indulge myself in these thoughts. So I intend to talk to you about where we can locate caste in international law today, or caste, or whatever we want to pronounce it as. But I mean, it's a very curious space that I'm talking about, and also because we are talking about an institution whose origins are unknown, and yet which exists in multiple forms, and it touches all lives in at a variety of spaces, including possibly, I would vouch for the fact that there is an economy around caste today. So I would just like to begin with this with a caveat here that the experience that I'm going to present before you today, and also try to show you about the place of the law in this, is something that I have largely been an observer of. It's only in the last few years, as I've become a serious observer, I have come to realize the privilege that I have been born into. And this is a very curious situation. Like, India is a land of paradoxes. And caste is one of the most important paradoxes that we are faced with. And I call this as a paradox because if I were to look at, and just yesterday we had our 70th years of the Republic, and the Republic declared itself as a constitutional democracy, and the Constitution actually talked to us about the idea of equality and living and non-discriminatory living, wherein all identities are actually not going to be held against or looked at from a point of a legal recognition being conferred to you on the basis of an identity. That's one of the constitutional reality. But I call this as a paradox because the same constitution also recognizes the role of the caste, right? And this is something that we are actually not able to overcome with any level of, with any level of improvement of the situation that has resulted because of this institution. And the paradox comes from the fact that while there is no area of life where a person can say that he's not touched by this institution, while I may not present myself as an individual belonging to a certain community or a caste, the state, which touches our lives at every imaginable space, and more so increasingly now, we find that the presence of caste is coming in because of the state trying to identify the caste of the individual even without his consent. So for example, and this is not something that is very new. So even before I go into the law explaining or the legal regime part of it, where does this idea of caste come in from? Even if I don't identify myself as a certain community, the state, whenever I'm asked to make a certain, request to the state, there is a high possibility of the caste coming in there, right? So while I can identify myself as a non-believer or a non-practitioner or an agnostic in any possible way, yet whenever I go before the state, there is a high possibility that the state takes notice of the identity that could be associated with me. And this happens because many of the benefits that are seen as entitlements are also caste linked. So you see, there is no way in which many of us can even escape this institution, even if we want to. I mean, there are many of us who are willing to or even overlooking this institution. But the way the economy and the polity has been built around this institution, we often see the presence of this institution within this jurisdiction, and also when people of Indian origin, or I can even say this to a certain extent with regard to South Asia, when they travel, they also find these instances there. Now, you must have heard many corporate, the big tech companies having a lot of South Asian population amongst their membership, also reporting stories related to certain exclusionary treatment based upon this identity. So here I am trying to present before you how this identity actually has come to be understood. Right? Now, I say this as has come to be understood is because none of us know when this institution actually began and the form that this institution began, right? There are people on every possible sides of the discussion around the caste take either an agnostic view to it or blame the religion to it, or try to blame the practices within the religion to it. They're all correct, and yet all of them are incomplete because none of us know where this began, right? And how this institution has evolved over it. But I can tell you the reasons for this evolutionary pattern of this particular institution in the context of how Hinduism is an evolutionary religion. Now, Hinduism is not a religion. I say this because the word Hinduism never existed as a form of, as a religion, say in the early parts of early decade or early centuries after the death of Christ. After Christ, we haven't seen this. It emerged as a form of religion probably around the late medieval times or mid-medieval times. And then it emerged as a religion because the practices empowered the people who are in power even more than what they already exercise. So you see, religion became a kind of a legitimating factor and also an empowering factor to enhance the power in their hands. And one of the best ways that they could actually achieve that enhanced empowerment is through using this institution of caste. Now, whether it was a social stratification alone or whether it was a kind of a work-related stratification at all is again a matter of debate. As I studied the religion for my research, I was given to understand that the texts of the religion, because, and again, I'm using the word text because there is absolutely no text for Hindu religion. We have many scriptures and you may follow them or you may not follow them. Right? See, this is one place where the autonomy of the religion, autonomy of the individual is much valued. But the religion that actually thought that the autonomy of the individual was the most important thing allowed the same autonomy to be used as a power instrument. And the methodology that was used was the institution of the caste. So we do not actually know how many castes are there, right? And what is the kind of a stratification? Yes, traditionally we were told that there were 4 castes, right? But that 4 castes is actually a loosely translated English version of what we call as the Chaturvarna. Now, I do not know if Varna is equal to caste, because Varna was just seen as a work-related stratification when the idea of Chaturvarna was first understood during the post-Rigvedic period, right? Now, again, we do not have a strict chronological explanation of this is post-Rigvedic period. But there were some historical accounts which have identified this work-related stratification during the post-Rigvedic period, right? But then again, the word 4, Chatur means 4, so 4 categories. So 4 categories essentially was understood as 4 castes much later, especially around the 5th to the 7th centuries, or rather the 4th to the 7th centuries, and especially in the early 4th and 5th centuries, there has been a huge level of power that was acquired through this institution becoming the methodology, and the Brahmanical and the warrior class started, using this institution as an exclusionary institution, right? So the first time we hear of a social exclusion as what we know today, marginalization, these are the terms that are often used in our polities and in our societies today. These were probably, we could find examples of these in the 4th and the 5th centuries, when we had seen some level of Brahminical superiority and the warrior class, the Kshatriya class, as in the kingship or this kind of thing. But this was mostly associated with land, and hence land and the ownership of land. So there is the economy around the land seen in the terms of only the ownership, and hence the idea of superiority. So something called a judgment. So what exactly is a judgment? Is something, it is the power that is associated with a certain community which was vested with ownership over the land. So over the years, this system continued to actually empower and enhance the power of the ruling class. And this stratification became much more rigid, right? Now, I was also told that there were some examples of mobility between these castes. So the stratification was not seen as a very strict one when it was practiced in the early medieval period. But as it went along, and you could see that the rigors of the religion became so strong, that the mobility between the religions was lost, between these castes was lost. So these became strict institutions that started explaining the power scenario. Now, all the rulers that have exercised power over what we call as India did not actually try to address the exclusionary practices, because it only helped them cement their power. So whether you call it the Hindu kings who were ruling before the Muslims invaded India, or probably the Muslim rulers, the institution of caste and the stratification of the society into the warrior class, the educated class, the business class, and the service class. These were the four general categorizations. They all thrived on continuing this kind of a division amongst the society. And now the division gained much more rigidity, and rigidity preventing mobility between the castes, and then interrelationship between the castes. All these things became alien terms, because these categories became much more like they've become much more cemented, because the institutions of powers enjoyed I would say they thrived because of these divisions in the society. So exclusionary practices were not even perceived as exclusionary practices at all, because they thought that a person who is born into a certain community deserved a certain kind of treatment. So the idea of birth and descent have come to explain what we earlier thought was something like a work-related, a loosely formed stratification of the society. Now, when the Britishers came in, the colonizers continued with this practice, and in fact, they enabled more oppressive practices. Now, what I'm going to show you now is a small picture of a story that happened, of an event that happened, in the early decades of the 20th century. And that just tries to bring to us the immense nature of this problem. And also it places an intersection in this. And that's where I try to present to you the story. As I said, I bring before you as an observer, because I haven't experienced this intersectionality as much as I was growing up, as many other women in India might experience. So I'm just going to show before you one particular picture, and then I'll show you the story around it. So this is basically a story of an event, or rather it's not a story, it's an event that probably brings before us the harshness of the idea or the institution of caste. And that harshness touches everyone except the people at the higher strata of the hierarchy. So the hierarchical nature of the society is somewhat explained in this particular event that I'm going to tell before you. So this is basically a small event that happened in 1935, but it actually makes a lot of sense even today, when you hear many stories around the women in India, the idea of caste in India. And this actually shows us the intersection of caste and gender, right? And one aspect that probably hasn't merited much discussion in the academic spaces is the intersection of caste and gender. And this actually presents that story before you. Right now, here is the picture of a young woman. This is a graphic picture that was actually drawn up later to give a pictorial depiction of this particular story. So this is a story of a young girl, 11 years old. And it was set in the year 1935 in what is supposed to be one of India's most liberated modern states today. And that is Kerala, right? In southern India, there is this particular community which is called as the Nambudri Brahmins. Now, the word Brahmin is basically the the highest strata of this so-called stratification. And this is the story of an 11-year-old girl who was married to a 60-year-old Nambudri Brahmin who happens to be the head of his family. Now, the Nambudri Brahmins, men, follow a particular tradition to prevent the property from splitting. And that's exactly why I call this as the economy of the caste, to ensure that the property is not split amongst the family. The younger male members of the family do not marry, and it is only the oldest member of this family gets, he marries, right? And this girl, who was all of 11 years old at the time that she got married to a 60-year-old man, right? After a few years of the marriage, she split up. And after she split up, and I'm using the word promiscuous that is already there in it, but with a lot of curiosity, because I'm going to tell you what she actually did was, I mean, she kind of shook the entire system which used the word promiscuous to her, right? So here, this girl, after a few years, her husband left her. That 60-year-old man, he left her. And then she went into having relationships with other men, secretly arranged by the servant of the family. So this continued for some years. And one day, it so happened that one of the men who visited her fell in love with her, and he removed her veil. And then it comes to be known that it was the same husband who left her. So he takes her to the court, which begins this trial. And the court was headed by the king, who was nothing but a puppet in the hands of the priestly class, which is all these Nambudri Brahmins. Right? So all these Nambudri Brahmins put her with this young girl to trial, who was by then 18. The trial goes on for 4 months. And through this trial, she was subject to every kind of a physical and mental torture, with the hope that she would confess and then get excommunicated, so that these men can teach a lesson to all the women that you should not cross path with the world of the Nambudri Brahmin men, right? And that's, I'm emphasizing on the word men because that is so very important to the story here. Now, this girl, she was a clever one at that. So what she goes and she says is, on the end of the trial, before the sentence is pronounced, she was asked to speak out. And then she says, if I were to be punished, 64 other men were to be punished, right? These 64 men were all the Brahmins who had relationship with this woman, with this young girl. And the 65th man was the king. And the king was so scared that even his name would come out. So what he goes ahead and he says is that, he says that she did not commit a crime, right? Because the word promiscuity cannot be attributed to her without holding all the men responsible, because that was the question that she asked the court. She said, if I am guilty, then I cannot be guilty alone, because every other man is also supposed to be guilty with me, because the crime for which I'm being held guilty cannot be committed by me alone. So here is an instance of where, the power of the Nambudri Brahmins was questioned, Brahmin men was questioned here, right? And to the extent that after this case, the Travancore royal family passed an edict, removing this decision-making power from the Nambudri Brahmins and thereby reducing their power. Now, if this was the story of one upper caste woman, right, what I'm going to show you next is the other side of the story. And that is why I began by saying that I am an observer here, because I'm only observing the experience of others, right? And the paradox that caste is, and the way it operates with gender, it makes women feel grateful rather than feel entitled, right? Sometimes as I sit back, I kind of feel grateful for the privilege that I have been conferred with, rather than feel entitled as a rights holder. Because the story that I'm going to show you next is exactly opposite to this story. Here, this girl, she had the courage to speak out. And I do not know if the courage came from the same upper caste that actually controlled her. Right? Now, this is the story of a very gory picture that happened a couple of years ago in India, where two young girls belonging to the marginalized communities, otherwise called as Dalits in India, these two girls were killed and they were hanged to a tree. Now, there was no fault of theirs except that they were, it's not even a fault. They were they were going out in the dark for their public, for accessing public facilities, right? But they went out in the dark, right? Now, the people who killed them wanted, or they proved, or they kind of came out and said that they wanted to kill them to prove their point in a dispute that they had with the families. So what happened here was that these two girls their bodies became the biomarkers of the power struggle between the upper caste communities and the marginalized sections with whom they were having problems. So again, here you see caste actually is not just having the angle of, kind of exclusion, but it is also trying to bring in the intersectionality of gender, whereby, if a lower caste person is supposed to be lower caste, we do not even know why this term is used at all. If they are supposed to be untouchables, right, then how come these women could be raped and killed and hanged like this? Right? So that means the woman's body is, the question of untouchability doesn't come there, right? So the issue of caste and purity and untouchability and all those issues which are otherwise there do not come anywhere near when we are talking about women's bodies. And secondly, women's bodies are, like, as I said, the geography of all your power struggles. So the entire geography of the power struggle associated with caste can be depicted by showing your power on the woman, right? This was a particular incident that happened a couple of years ago. And these are not stray incidents here. Incidents like these are actually pretty common when we talk about the caste relations in India, right? Now, why is it that this caste becomes such a huge problem here? Right. It's because that the idea of purity is attached with all living in Hindu India. And I'm talking about Hindu India. Hindu India understands the idea of purity and impurity. So you can find that certain people are pure, certain people are not coming within that category. Now, what do we mean by pure? Right? This just sounds so disgusting to hear. Well, the idea of purity is understood from the concept of birth. So you are born into a certain community which has for generations been identified as coming in from associated with purity, right? So how did this association with purity come in, right? So that association came in from two aspects. One, knowledge, and the other one, performance of rituals, right? So power came to be associated with rituals and knowledge. So these two became the proprietary value of certain communities, and the rest all who do not fall into those communities are seen as untouchables or as seen as affected with purity. Now, here again, there is a small intersection that comes in. Even within the upper caste, there is so much more of purity and impurity that is associated. So, for example, women are seen as both pure and impure at the same time. Certain women are seen as pure, and certain women are seen as affected by impurity. So you see, untouchability, which is understood in the idea of purity and impurity, is not just addressing via caste, but it is also cutting into gender, right? So all this is what we actually call as understanding India from the perspective of the male upper caste individual, Hindu individual, right? So the Hindu upper caste male individual is the standard, and anyone who does not fall into that category is affected by untouchability and impurity of varying levels. Some of them might be permanently seen as untouchables, and so on. So this is basically the sociology of caste. Now, how does it come into it? It talks in the idea, in the way of untouchability. So sometimes you may not be allowed access to public places. We do see this, right? Homes might ask some people to sit outside the threshold. So every Hindu house has a threshold in front of it, a wooden the door frame is actually not a three-piece door frame, but it is a four-piece door frame. And the fourth piece, which is touching the surface, is actually used as a separator. So the idea of purity is understood, or it is demonstrated by using that wooden piece as a separator. So if you are belonging to their community, you come inside, or else you sit out on the other side of that threshold. So you see, the geography of the home is also the place where the caste thrives, right? The second way in which it thrives in the homes is largely seen through the way women are, young girls are understood. So as a girl reaches the puberty, the idea of menstruation is also addressed with purity and impurity, right? And the Hindu society, as we know of it today, is even more finding ways to get near that. While we are supposed to be more progressive in going away from all those practices, in fact, the economy of the religion allows these practices to survive, because there is so much of celebration of religion in the popular culture, right? And the popular culture finds all these as a method of economic value to them. So you would find movies, and you would find literature, and you would find, families and temples all of them actually hosting these kind of practices. So very recently you had one of the temples in India become a much of a discussion in the India's highest court. The Supreme Court of India actually had to go back upon its own decision. And I use the word go back because it had to actually review its own decision with regard to allowing women an entry into the temple, irrespective of whether they are menstruating women or not. Right? So these are the ways in which the caste touches us. So where is it that there is a law in all this? Right? Now, I call this as trying to position this within international law because I want to build a certain argument, a certain, foundation for this legal regime affecting the idea of caste. So we have, one of the most common understandings that the law has taken notice of. Right? Now, there is no definition for caste in India as far as the law is concerned. There is so much of sociological development. There is an anthropological studies. And of course, there are theological studies related to it. But the law has not actually given any definition. But the way the law is structured around, it loosely tries to understand this definition to it. So it calls the law as a social institution composed of endogamous descent groups, ranked hierarchically. So the idea of affirmative action addressing marginalization is based upon this meaning of the caste, that caste is an endogamous descent group which is ranked hierarchically. So we have what we call as the 4 known castes, right? 4 recognized castes, which are like the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas, and the Shudras. Now, the Shudras is a very composite term, while sociologists would classify the Dalits as outside the 4 level stratification, the law places them in this composite term called the Shudras. So the Dalits, as far as the law is concerned, their position is understood within this particular term called the Shudras, which the law does not mention it, but it tries to classify them under or use that term for having its own legally recognized classification. So the legally recognized classification that we have is what we called as the scheduled castes. Right? Now, the scheduled caste is a collection of 72 communities which are otherwise socially known as the Shudras or the Dalits. Right? So now, where does the colonizers come into this picture? The colonizers were what I would say strictly no touch kind of rulers as far as caste is concerned, right? They had something called a very light touch approach is what I would want to call it, for want of a better word, because they actually left every kind of a question which could be designated as a caste question to be decided by local courts, or what we would call as the caste panchayat. So panchayat is nothing but a group of the village headmen, and the village headmen would normally be people from that community, and here it is the upper caste communities. Right? So the lower caste having their own organized panchayat or the community dispute resolution mechanism was not known at all. Right, except that probably it worked in a very, in a very loosely organized, or it was not even organized at all. It just worked, within their own local handling methods. But there was never an organized structure of a dispute resolution as we would know in the upper caste communities. So what the Britishers did was that every issue was that was not contractual or commercial in nature, was left to be decided by the personal laws, and that would actually be understood only by the caste panchayats and especially the upper caste groups. So the upper caste man was called in and he exercised this knowledge power, and hence he would give out a pronouncement. So every question that is not a commercial or a contractual question was classified as a caste question, right? Even if there was physical violence involved in it, it would still not be seen as a violence and as a matter of criminal law, right? So all these were because they had a caste connection to it, and all economic and human relations were understood only within the parameters of the caste. Hence, every question outside contractual questions became questions of the caste, including criminal law questions. So, for example, as what Foucault calls as structural violence was something that was not even understood within the law at all. Right. So it was only in the early 20th century that caste became something like an empowering activity when the when the East India Company's regime moved into the moved away, and it was replaced by the Crown regime, and also that too in the 20th century when we had the first reforms with regard to electoral constituencies. So there was some kind of a very traditional way of mapping what would probably be called as a caste gerrymandering. Right? Because constituencies were drawn on the basis of caste, wherein the geography, because all communities lived on the, I mean, their habitats were also designated on the basis of caste. Right? So you wouldn't have people from different communities living in one area. That was a very rare thing. Right? Most of the times people, for their own security and belongingness, they would live amongst their own people. So it was all like caste ghettos, if I can call that. And hence, electoral maps were, when there were entitlements given out to these castes in the, as far as, electoral representation, there was the maps were also drawn on the basis of the habitats, and hence caste habitats came to be recognized. So people, the idea of, living in a, so their habitats were also basically endogamous. It's not just their descent was endogamous, the habitats were also endogamous, and hence the law recognized them as such. So, for example, something which was like a 17th century habitat, a Brahmin habitat, like what you would see in Western Indian city of Pune called Shaniwar Wada, right? It still exists today as Shaniwar Wada with the same name, because people were habituated to the idea of living in that habitat, and the law has done very little, because these were all private questions, right? These were outside the space of law. These were all caste questions. So the way people lived, the people related to each other, since everything is done around the idea of caste, all human beings living from the time that a person was born to the time that he left the planet, he or she was understood only from the perspective of caste. You lived in it, you married into it, you gave birth to a few more, and then when a person left the world, he was buried in that, he was buried or burned based upon, cremated based upon his caste practice. So the practices also came to be evolved around this institution, and hence it was very convenient for the Britishers to actually not address these questions at all. It's better to leave them, right? So when independent India started addressing this problem, it built in a constitutional vision, right? So this is probably what we call as the constitutional vision. This is what India sought about. So the 1950 Constitution, it began with the idea that we are a land of equals. So equals means first calling out on the recognitions and removing the caste related recognitions. So independent India decided to do away, when it called itself as a republic, it did away with all the kind of caste related recognitions. So the idea of somebody being a pandit, right, entitling him to some level of a value, that was removed. Or somebody being a zamindar or a landed owner. Zameen is basically land, and zamindar is the guy who acquired all the power because he's the landlord. So we gave up on all those privileges that were associated with the ranks, and there were no longer ranks at all. Right. So this was basically the constitutional vision. Now the Constitution went ahead and it also tried to address one issue. It thought that removing the ranks is not going to make people come together and say that, hey, from today we are all going to be equal, and hence we will practice equality amongst us. We know that that is not possible, right? So it again went on a proactive affirmative action approach. Now, the first thing it did on that affirmative action scenario was to proscribe untouchability, right? Now, the Constitution says that articles abolition of untouchability. But therein lies the dilemma, and that's why I call India as the land of paradox, right? We say abolition of untouchability, but we don't. The law does not give you a definition of untouchability. So what it essentially did under the heading of abolition of untouchability was that certain public spaces were made accessible to everyone, irrespective of any of the identity related issues, right? That's the only thing that the law could do. Now, mind you, this problem is persisting 70 odd years down the line. We are still unable to come to terms with this because of this absence. The law consciously staying away from a definition. It's not that we do not have a definition for untouchability. Sociologists have done excellent work. Anthropologists have produced a lot of literature related to untouchability. But somehow the law hasn't taken notice of it except to identify some practices. Right? And so what it went on was that in the last 70 years, it made variety of laws as and when it perceived that this could be an untouchability related scenario. Right? But then that kind of a minimal effort did not actually hold value to it because of the economy built around it. Right? And when I say the economy, the idea of land reforms did not work. Right? So when we had the ownership and the resources only with a few people, and those few people belong to the upper caste. So, you know, the hierarchy of the caste plus the economy of the land. That can be a deadly cocktail that could unleash atrocities. And that's exactly what happened. So this wonderful constitutional vision that we are going to abolish untouchability, we are going to ensure that we would go on an affirmative action process whereby we take notice of the lived experience of people, right? All this put together made some difference, but not significant enough for a country whose population is 1.3 billion, right? And many states in India, many of the federal units actually account for more of these scheduled castes or the so-called Shudra or the Dalit communities, which are on the lowest part of the hierarchy, the lowest rung of the hierarchy, even all these years after economic empowerment, right? And that's because essentially, I mean, this is my understanding, the absence of a definition for this idea of untouchability, or the reluctance of the state to actually address the problem of untouchability by its horns is the reason why we have this problem. What we have always seen is these piecemeal efforts. So I come from, and here I would like to bring in my personal experience as an observer. So in the 90s, when I attended the law school, one morning we woke up to this news that an entire colony of Dalit people has been massacred by people belonging to the upper caste communities in my own state where I come, in my own province that I come from, in southern India. Right. When I looked at it, when I went back to the school that morning and I looked at, how equality as an institution, as a constitutional institution worked, I found that this is not a story in isolation, right? So where we have come from, exclusionary practices, today caste has become the basis for physical violence, not just structural violence, but we also see physical violence amongst the caste. Right. And this incident that I have witnessed as a student in the law school was in the 90s. But in 2015, I am told that the entire lot of accused people, 72 people who were accused in that massacre of the 1990s. In 2015, all of them were acquitted. Right? It just goes to show that 25 years later, there is still no justice to the victims of that particular incident. Now, that actually brings us to the fact that why is it that these things are a problem in India, despite all the good intentions of the state and the efforts of the state to actually criminalize these atrocities that come in the name of caste, right? I'm not even touching the gender aspect here. Yeah, thanks, Leila. Right, that's because, untouchability associated with the idea of dissent, which is what caste and the problems associated with caste is all about, is something that is not accepted under the Indian law as on the face of it. What we have only done is to address the problem with these piecemeal approaches. Now, it's not only that the government of India did not accept it, but if you look at international law and India's presence in the international law, for example, the human rights instruments did not even take notice of the idea that race also means caste. Right. So it took like a lot of time, for a lot of effort, like a couple of decades for effort by the civil society activists to actually make the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination aware of the idea that race could also include something like discrimination based upon work and dissent. Right? So much so that the civil society activists were actually able to get this onto the Durban Conference agenda, wherein unfortunately the government of India tried to show that race is a biological construct, whereas caste is a social construct, and hence caste and dissent cannot be looked at within the idea of race. And hence we still could not achieve the idea that human rights instruments can actually take notice of caste as a part of the discrimination based upon work and dissent. Now, it's a very interesting scenario here. While in other disciplines, you would find that caste has achieved international, interest. And there is a lot of work that is going on in other disciplines as far as caste is concerned. International lawyers are somewhere missing from the scene. There are just about a couple of efforts that I could find wherein there has been a discussion with regard to the absence of international law discussion related to discrimination based upon caste. Or rather, why is it that we cannot actually take caste into the idea of descent-based discrimination at all? And one of the critical approaches that could be a facilitator in making international law take notice of this is what I would call the third world approaches. Because if you look at the way the third world approaches are actually placed in, their job is to make, or to prepare or to endeavor to develop scholarship on the rights of the peoples in the former colonies, right? And how colonial practices persist in the colonies even after independence. And probably that's probably the reason why the third world approaches can actually be deployed here to understand if there is a way to make the descent-based discrimination definition inclusive enough to include caste-based discrimination, because it is essentially that, right? So I rest my presentation here, and I thank you very much for your time. And yes, I'm looking for more, comments and, support from you in my research here.
Thank you so much, Ramani. Again, fascinating. It's such a complex topic, really. We would need so many more hours for everybody to understand the complexity from, again, a historical, religious, sociological, anthropological perspective. You touch upon, in a very interesting manner, a number of very important issues, also including your own perspective, your own living experience of the caste system. We've received questions. I'm conscious of time, but I'd like to ask you a few questions that we've received from our colleagues, because it's really important. The first question, it's a natural one. It comes from our colleague, Sebastian Deverage, whom you know, who's a fellow Bangalore citizen, so to speak. Yes. And Sebastian asks the following: there are many aspects on which Ramani has thrown light upon, especially as an observer. I would like to know if Ramani has consciously avoided mentioning Dr. Abankar, who perhaps not suffered cruelty of the institution of caste, but wrote extensively on all aspects of the caste system. And of course, I got prepared. Here you go. The famous one, the annihilation of caste. Of course, we can't talk about caste in the Constitution without mentioning that. So, Ramani, I suppose that was not conscious.
It's not at all a conscious one. I mean, and you cannot have a constitutional vision without Dr. Ambedkar, right? That's my feeling. And I think whatever little was achieved into the Constitution is only because of Ambedkar's efforts right from the time the Pune Pact, that is during the pre-independence time, to what we have today. In fact, that the vision of at least having that particular article titled as Abolition of Untouchability was all because of his efforts. I don't think independent India would actually have sat up and taken notice of this if it were not to be his effort. So no, it was not a conscious thing. It was just that, there were too many things that need to be covered in this space. So I just thought that I will not be taking the names, but I would just be presenting the issues before you. But Sebastian, thanks for it. I think I should be taking notice of that. Probably next time I will be on that course correction. Thanks, Sebastian.
And maybe, as we said, next time we can have a presentation on the Constitution itself, and that would take us a lot of time already. But everybody, if you've not read it, read the book of the most famous, probably, book of Abankar, The Annihilation of Caste. It's probably one of the greatest, surely one of the greatest things. Yeah. And as Ramani was saying, he's brought immense contribution, not only to the Indian constitution, but I would say to the world really in defining oppression and fighting against it for equality and freedom. Now we have another question from Tamil, and I'm sure you're guessing what's the question. It's 12 related. So we know that 12 is third world approaches to international law, as you said. The idea is to sort of replace the third world in the international making. What a fascinating talk, says Tamil. I have so many questions, comments, but if I may ask one question, our cherished colleague, Shrivan Asbura, writes in an article, as a response to such a situation, Black scholars articulated an anti-discrimination discourse through a critical engagement which emerged as critical race theory, used mainly in the US academia. The 12 scholarship that is specifically emerging from the South Asian subcontinent has an opportunity to engage with the question of caste discrimination in the context of international law. So my question, to what extent can 12 be fertilized through CTR, critical, in order to address, remedy, and tackle caste discrimination within international law?
I've just hung up a particular slide, brought out a particular slide here, which talks about the vision of TWAIL. And in the TWAIL statement, way back in the 90s, the TWAIL statement, especially its vision number 2, it kind of states that it highlights the need to formulate a substantive critique of the politics and scholarship of mainstream international law to the extent that it has helped reproduce structures that marginalize and dominate third world peoples. So I think this TWAIL could be the best way or the best methodology that we could have to actually place the subalterns and the exclusion of the subalterns within the idea of the descent-based discrimination. So probably this is the only methodology that we could use. In fact, I would go to the extent of saying that TWAIL could be the only methodology that we can use. If only we I think the work has actually begun in spaces, not strictly in the idea of international law alone, but there are a couple of examples that I can see. Balakrishna Rajgopal has written this in the context of social movements. Can we actually try to find a similar effort with regard to caste-based discrimination? In fact, I think one of the interesting articles written by Annapurna Vagre, she talks about, the place of caste in the international human rights. I think those two writings are an interesting space to start off with, and then try to find much more meaning to the vision statement of TWAIL. Because I don't find another methodology to actually address this, because I think for the last 30 odd years, civil society groups have been trying to find an explanation through the sociological approach of finding, descent-based discrimination into the idea of race. So trying to find, that symbiosis between race and caste through the vehicle of descent. I think somewhere they have done a lot of effort, but they were not successful. So possibly we can use TWAIL as a deployment method for this one.
As a sort of a follow-up question, and hopefully a bit of a thought-provoking one. The problem with TWAIL is that they see domination only within the third world to start with. And second aspect is that, I don't know whether it's related or not, but a lot of TWAIL members are originally from South Asia. So are they consciously avoiding the question of caste?
So I think, I think you are correct for a certain way, because I think to start off with, the preoccupation of Twailers has largely been with the idea of a post-colonial understanding of international law, right? So they were all the while only addressing the issue of questioning the colonizers, and then, you know, with the globalization, they moved to the transnational capital, and then calling it as a transnational capitalist class. So they never had the space to actually look inwards, except probably we had seen social movements also with Balakrishna Rajgopal, as I said, but then that was also in the context of the colonizers, right? So possibly they could look at how the colonial understandings persist with us. And for that reason, probably I think TWAIL could be a methodology if only they can turn inwards and look at how subalterns are being treated. Right? So, because if you see most of the laws, the structure of the law that we have today addressing caste is something that has been a colonial law, right? The way 1935 law, or even the previous efforts of, the British, the British ruler government in India. So, since the law itself is finding some level of a connection to the pre-independence thing, it is better to actually use TWAIL as a methodology to find, to place the subalterns and the struggle of the subalterns, the exclusion of the subalterns. I do not even know if there is much documentation, except probably a rare effort here and there, wherein subaltern struggle has been documented in the context of caste by Twailers. We need to do that.
True. In response to that, follow-up comment by Sebastian, would it not be an attempt to shift the responsibility to an outsider for what you are responsible yourself?
How do you explain that responsible yourself? Because I don't think we are free from the colonial laws as yet. I know it is a long period since we have been independent, but I don't think we can act, because this institution and the way this institution has been functioning is not something that is of today, right? In fact, the way the 200 years of the British rule has actually cemented much of the exclusionary practices that were hitherto loosely organized in a variety of communities, right? I mean, they were the ones who turned it into the modern law. So I don't think we can actually remove that part and then say that everything today. No, I'm just trying to say that the methodology of the post-colonial state that Twailers often use can actually be turned inwards and try to see where we ourselves are at fault. Right? It's not that the Indian state's responsibility is now being wiped out. No. We are just trying to see how the Indian state finds it convenient to persist with those practices.
Right. So probably we could call that the sort of methodology or persistence of oppression as well, rather than, naming it as only the colonizer or one particular actor.
Yeah, I mean, we have all the freedom to give up on that, right? Of course, the Indian government should have gone forward and done much more than that. Yeah, it did not do. But then, if I were to just speak about the 70 years, then the entire problem and the lived experience of people, right? I mean, there is so much, like, as an observer, yet I'm able to feel the kind of, scenario that is happening around me. And this is not something that is happening only now, right? There is a whole lived experience that is attached. Now, the story of the woman that I began the presentation with, right? It is that story, that lived experience is so relevant even today.
Yes. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Ramani, again, I'm conscious of time, but I'd like to mention a comment by Devran. Devran is a PhD candidate. She's my PhD candidate working on gender issues. A very interesting and informative presentation. Thanks a lot. I don't have a question, but I'd like to mention a book that I'm currently reading, Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. She explains systemic racism in the US through the lens of caste. It's an interesting read.
Thank you so much for this recommendation. Thank you. Thank you. I will return to this as soon as I exhaust my existing reading, my current readings. I will return to that. But thanks so much for this recommendation.
Excellent. Well, I think we have to bring this really interesting discussion to a close. Thank you so much, Ramani. Thanks very much to everyone for being such a great audience. As you know, the meeting has been recorded. You're going to find it under the banner Research Futures on our website. I'd like to thank my team, Gloria, Olga, her, Claudia in particular, for supporting the organization. And again, thank everyone for coming. We'll have another session next week on a completely different topic, yet a very important one related to access to health. So thank you so much, Ramani, for your presentation. And there is so much to read, and we're looking forward to your publication, including one article that you've recently published on the topic, which is in which journal, you said?
Yeah, that's the Journal of Indian Law Institute.
The Journal of the Indian Law Institute. So that's very easy to find on the exact topic. Thank you so much, everyone, and see you next week.
Thank you. Thanks, Karen. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.